The bride wore black because white felt like a lie. And in the year 1349, lies were the only things dying faster than people. Her name was Marjorie, and she was 23 years old, which made her ancient by the standards of that terrible autumn. The plague had come to their village in June, arriving with a merchant who traveled from Bristol with silk thread and seeds of death sewn into his very breath. By July, the church bells had stopped ringing for the dead because there was no one left to pull the ropes and no point in marking what had become ordinary. By August, Marjorie's mother, father, 2 brothers, and baby sister had all been carried to the plague pits on the edge of town, their bodies tumbled in with dozens of others, limes scattered over them like bitter snow. Now it was September, and she was getting married. The ceremony took place in the doorway of St. Catherine's Church, because Father Benedict refused to let anyone inside anymore. He'd seen too much death within those walls, had administered last rites to too many writhing, blackened bodies, and he'd developed a superstition that the plague lived in the very stones of the sanctuary. So he stood in the threshold, 1 foot in the holy space and 1 foot in the world, as if he could balance between salvation and damnation. And he spoke the words that would bind Marjorie to Thomas Carpenter, in the sight of God and whoever else might be watching. There were 11 people at the wedding. In the time before, there would have been 100, maybe more. The baker would have made special bread. The butcher would have roasted a pig. There would have been music and dancing, and drunk uncles telling inappropriate stories, while children ran between the legs of adults, stealing sweets and getting underfoot. Marjorie's mother would have cried, the way mothers do, tears of joy mixed with the bittersweetness of watching a daughter become a wife. But the baker was dead. The butcher was dead. The uncles were dead. The children were dead. And Marjorie's mother was dead, and there was no one to cry tears of any kind except Marjorie herself, and she discovered that her tears had simply stopped coming somewhere around the time they'd taken her sister's body away. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Thomas stood beside her in the church doorway, his hand warm against hers, and that warmth was its own kind of miracle. Warm meant alive. Warm meant not yet claimed by the pestilence that had turned so many bodies cold. He was 31, a widower, his first wife having died in childbirth 2 years before the plague came, which seemed like a cruel joke now to have survived that loss, only to face this greater dying all around them. But Thomas had survived. He'd watched friends and neighbors fall, had helped carry bodies when there were still enough living to form carrying parties, and somehow the plague had passed him by. That was why they were marrying. Not for love, though Marjorie thought she could grow to love him, given time and peace. Not for passion, though Thomas was kind enough and not unpleasant to look at. They were marrying because they were alive, and because the village needed people to keep living, to plant crops and mend roofs, and perhaps, God willing, to bring new children into a world that had devoured so many. The priest rushed through the words. Everyone rushed through everything now. Lingering felt dangerous, as if death might notice you if you stood still too long. Father Benedict's voice was hoarse. He'd been hoarse for weeks, though whether from grief or from the constant prayers for the dead, or from his own nascent illness, no one could say. Marjorie didn't look at him too closely. She'd learned not to look too closely at anyone's neck or armpits or groins, where the buboes first appeared, like obscene fruits pushing up through the skin. Do you, Marjorie, daughter of Hugh, take this man Thomas as your lawful wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? The sick irony of those words, in sickness and in health, would have made her laugh in another time. Now she just said, "I do," and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, like it belonged to someone else, someone who still believed in futures and forevers. Thomas said his vows too, and then Father Benedict was pronouncing them man and wife, and Thomas was kissing her, his lips dry and chapped, but alive, alive, alive. The 11 witnesses' neighbors, mostly, the remnants of families that had been much larger, murmured their approval or their condolences, or perhaps just their relief that life was insisting on continuing despite everything. Afterward, they walked to Thomas's house, which was now Marjorie's house too. It was a good house, well built, with a thatched roof and a proper hearth and 2 rooms instead of 1. Thomas's carpentry skills had served him well. Even in the time of plague, there was work for a man who could build coffins, though he'd largely given up that grim trade in recent weeks. There weren't enough nails, and there wasn't enough wood, and anyway, most people had stopped using coffins at all. The dead went into the ground wrapped in whatever cloth could be spared, if that. Inside, there was food, bread and cheese, and a bit of salted meat, ale that Thomas's neighbor had brewed before she died, and her surviving son had brought as a wedding gift. It was a feast by current standards. They ate quietly, the 11 guests seated on benches in the floor, and someone tried to start a song, but couldn't remember all the words and trailed off awkwardly. The silence that followed was heavy with ghosts. Marjorie found herself studying the faces around her, these people who remained. Old Peter the shepherd, whose wife and 3 children were gone. Young Alice, barely 15, whose entire family had been wiped out and who now lived with a cousin. John the smith, who lost his left arm to an infection last year, and his son to the plague last month. Margaret Weaver, Sarah Miller, Edmund Tanner, William Fletcher, and Cook, each with their own litany of losses, their own catalogue of the dead. And yet here they were, eating bread and cheese, witnessing a wedding, participating in the rituals that said life would go on. Marjorie felt a strange gratitude toward them, these survivors, these witnesses. They could have stayed home. They could have hidden in their houses, waiting for death or salvation. But they'd come. They stood in the doorway of the church and watched 2 people promise to build a future in the ruins of the past. When the food was gone and the ale was drunk, the guests left. There were no extended celebrations, no dancing until dawn. It was nearly evening, and no one wanted to be out after dark anymore. The night felt dangerous now, full of invisible threats. People hurried to their homes and barred their doors and prayed to make it through to morning. Marjorie and Thomas were alone in the house that smelled of sawdust and smoke. The bed was in the second room, a real bed with a straw mattress and wool blankets, another sign of Thomas's relative prosperity. In the life before, Marjorie would have been nervous about the wedding night, would have been coached by her mother and older female relatives about what to expect, would have giggled with friends about the mysteries of marriage. But her mother was dead, and her friends were dead, and she'd seen so much of death as obscenity that the intimacies of life held no power to frighten her. Thomas was gentle with her. He was experienced, having been married before, and he seemed to understand without being told that she needed tenderness, needed to be reminded that bodies could create pleasure as well as pain, could generate life instead of just hosting death. Afterward, they lay together in the darkness, and Thomas's hand found hers again, that warmth, that pulse of life. "I loved my first wife," Thomas said quietly. "Her name was Eleanor. I need you to know that. I loved her, and I grieved her." "I know," Marjorie said. She did know. Everyone in the village had known Thomas and Eleanor, had seen how he mourned. "But I think I can love you too," Thomas continued. "Not in the same way, but in a way that's ours. If you'll let me." Marjorie squeezed his hand. "I'd like that," she said, and she meant it. Love seemed like a radical act now, a defiance hurled at death itself. They fell asleep that way, hands clasped, 2 living people in a world of the dead. And when Marjorie woke in the night to the sound of dogs howling in the distance, Thomas was still breathing beside her, and she counted that as a victory. The weeks that followed established the rhythm of their new life together. Thomas worked on repairs around the village, fixing broken doors and collapsing roofs and fence posts that had rotted. There was plenty of work now because there were so few people to do it, and the infrastructure of daily life was crumbling. Marjorie took over the tasks that had been Eleanor's: cooking, cleaning, tending the small garden behind the house, caring for the chickens that had somehow survived while their owners hadn't. They didn't talk much about the plague, though it was always there, an invisible guest at every meal, a shadow in every corner. The dying had slowed, but not stopped. Every few days, someone else would fall ill, would develop the fever and the swellings, and the horrible black discoloration that gave the pestilence its name. Father Benedict continued to administer last rites, though he looked more exhausted each time Marjorie saw him. The grave diggers, the few who remained, could barely keep up with demand. But there were also signs of life's stubborn persistence. Old Peter's sheep had lambs impossibly, in the wrong season, but there they were anyway, wobbling on stick legs. Young Alice turned out to have a gift for healing, not for curing the plague. Nothing could cure the plague, but for easing the other ailments that still afflicted people, the broken bones and fevers and wounds. She'd learned from watching her mother, apparently, and now she moved through the village with her basket of herbs and tinctures, offering what comfort she could. Marjorie found a strange peace in the routines of household work. There was something meditative about kneading bread, about sweeping floors, about mending Thomas's shirts. These tasks connected her to all the women who'd come before, who'd done these same things, who'd kept life moving forward through wars and famines and plagues and every other horror. She thought often of her mother, whose hands had been cracked and work-worn, but always warm, always capable. She tried to hold her mother's memory in the rhythm of her work, kneading it into bread, weaving it into cloth. Thomas, for his part, seemed to be trying to build their future with the same focused intensity he brought to his carpentry. He was planning. He talked about the spring planting, about which fields would need to be rotated, about whether they should try to acquire more chickens or perhaps a pig. He talked about children, tentatively, watching Marjorie's face for her reaction. "We'll need sons," he said one evening as they sat by the fire. "Daughters, too. The village will need people. Someone has to survive this." Marjorie felt a complex tangle of emotions at his words. Fear, because pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous, even in good times, and these were not good times. Grief, because she thought of her own mother, bearing 6 children and losing them all, ultimately to the plague. But also something else, a flicker of hope, maybe, or defiance. Children would be an act of faith. Children would say that tomorrow mattered. "Yes," she said. "We'll need children." "Not yet," Thomas added quickly. "Not while the plague is still so fierce. But when it passes—" "If it passes," Marjorie corrected gently. "When?" Thomas insisted. He needed to believe in when. They both did. November came, and with it the cold. The plague seemed to ease a bit in the colder weather, or perhaps there were simply fewer people left to kill. The village that had once held 300 souls now had perhaps 70. The church records, meticulously kept by Father Benedict in better times, had become a horror show, page after page filled with death dates. He'd stopped recording them sometime in September. What was the point? Everyone knew who was gone. Marjorie and Thomas celebrated Christmas with a handful of others in Father Benedict's house because the church still felt cursed to him. They sang hymns, their voices thin in the cold air, and shared what food they had. It wasn't much the harvests had been poor, with so few hands to bring them in, and supplies were running low. But they sang anyway, and they prayed, and they pretended for a few hours that the world was normal, that this was just another Christmas, like all the Christmases before. Father Benedict led them in prayer, but Marjorie could see the doubt in his eyes. He was a man whose faith had been tested past breaking. How many dying people had he blessed? How many times had he promised God's mercy to someone whose flesh was rotting while they still lived? And yet he continued to pray, continued to perform the rituals, because what else was there? Without faith, there was only the plague, only death, only darkness. After Christmas, a deep cold settled over the land. Snow fell, unusual for their region, and it covered everything in white, hiding the neglect, the abandoned houses, the overgrown fields. For a little while, the village looked beautiful, almost peaceful. Children who'd survived, and there were so few children now, played in the snow, throwing snowballs and building lopsided snowmen, acting like children ought to act. The adults watched them with desperate affection, treasuring these moments of normalcy. Marjorie discovered she was pregnant in January. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but hadn't said anything, afraid to name it, afraid that speaking it aloud would somehow curse it. But finally, when she was certain, she told Thomas. His face went through a complicated series of expressions: joy, fear, wonder, terror. Finally, he pulled her close and held her tightly, and she felt him shaking. "A baby," he whispered. "God help us, a baby." It was a prayer and a curse and a celebration all at once. The pregnancy progressed through the winter and into the spring. Marjorie was sick in the mornings, exhausted in the afternoons, and increasingly enormous as the baby grew inside her. Young Alice checked on her regularly, bringing herbs for the nausea, and offering advice she'd learned from her mother and grandmother, that long line of female wisdom that stretched back through time. "You're strong," Alice told her during one visit. "Your body knows what to do." Marjorie wanted to believe her. But she thought of Thomas's first wife, Eleanor, who died bringing his child into the world. She thought of her own mother, who'd survived 6 childbirths but hadn't survived the plague. Strength, it turned out, was no guarantee of anything. The spring brought its own set of challenges. The fields needed planting, but there weren't enough people to work them properly. Thomas and the other surviving men did what they could, and some of the women helped too, including Marjorie, until she got too heavy to bend comfortably. They'd planted less than in previous years, focused on the crops that would keep them alive: barley and rye, some beans and peas. The wheat fields, which had once stretched golden in the summer sun, were left fallow. There simply weren't hands to harvest wheat. And the plague continued its slow burn through the population. Not as fierce as in the autumn, but still present, still claiming lives. Father Benedict fell ill in March. The irony was not lost on anyone, the man who'd attended so many dying people finally falling victim himself. He developed the fever, the swellings. Young Alice tried to help him, bringing cool cloths and tinctures to ease his pain. But they all knew how this would end. He died on a Thursday, quietly in his bed, and they buried him in the churchyard beside all the people he'd blessed in death. Thomas said some words over the grave, because there was no priest now, no one to perform the rites. The remaining villagers stood in the spring rain and mourned not just the man, but what he represented: the old order, the familiar rituals, the certainty of faith. Without a priest, weddings and baptisms and funerals became strange, improvised affairs. People made up their own words, drew on half-remembered liturgies, did their best to honor God and the dead and the living. It was heretical, probably, but the church was far away and focused on its own survival. And anyway, God had seen fit to allow the plague, so perhaps the usual rules no longer applied. Marjorie's baby came in late July, on a hot afternoon when the air hung thick and heavy. The labor was long and painful and terrifying, but young Alice was with her and Thomas's neighbor Margaret, and they talked her through it, told her when to push and when to breathe, and assured her that she was doing well, that everything was normal, that the baby was coming. And then, after hours that felt like years, there was a new sound in the room, a thin, outraged wail of a newborn. A son. Marjorie held him while Alice cleaned him and checked him over, counting his fingers and toes, making sure everything was as it should be. He was small but seemed healthy, with a shock of dark hair and Thomas's nose and lungs that worked perfectly, as evidenced by his vigorous crying. Thomas came in after, having been banished during the birth itself, and when he saw the baby, his face crumpled. He knelt beside the bed and touched the baby's tiny hand with one calloused finger, and the baby gripped it reflexively, and Thomas made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "A son," he said. "We have a son." They named him Hugh, after Marjorie's father. It felt important to carry that name forward, to link the past to the future, to say that the dead were not forgotten. Little Hugh, they called him, to distinguish him from Big Hugh who was gone. Little Hugh who had arrived in a world of death, but who carried life in his tiny, perfect body. The baptism was a strange affair, performed by Thomas himself, with water from the village well, in words he dememorized from hearing Father Benedict say them so many times. It probably wasn't valid, technically, but it felt important to perform the ritual, to welcome this new life into the community of believers, to claim some protection from the divine for this vulnerable new soul. "I baptize you, Hugh, in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit," Thomas said, dripping water onto the baby's head. Hugh screamed his objection, healthy and strong, and everyone laughed, and for a moment the shadow of the plague lifted. The months that followed were both the hardest and the happiest of Marjorie's life. The baby needed constant care, feeding and changing and holding and comforting. She was exhausted always, her body still recovering from the birth, her nights broken into fragments by Hugh's demands. But there was joy in it too, his tiny fingers wrapping around hers. His first smile, probably just gas, but she chose to believe it was real. The way he'd settle against her chest and fall asleep, trusting completely in her protection. Thomas was besotted with his son. He'd rush home from work to hold the baby, would walk him around the house in the evenings, singing old songs in a surprisingly sweet voice. He'd lost his first child when Eleanor died, that baby who'd never drawn breath, and Marjorie could see him pouring all that deferred love into Hugh. The plague continued, but it had become almost background noise now, a constant low threat that they'd learned to live with. People still died, still developed the telltale signs, and suffered and passed, but not as many, not as quickly. The survivors had developed a kind of grim competence at managing death. They knew the signs, knew when to isolate someone, knew how to dispose of contaminated belongings. It didn't stop the disease, but it slowed it, maybe. Autumn came again, a year since Marjorie's wedding, and the anniversary felt significant. A year of marriage, a year of survival, a year that had given her Thomas and Hugh, and a future she hadn't been sure would exist. The village held a harvest festival, or passed for one now. There was food, though not much, and someone played a fiddle, and people danced a little, awkwardly, as if they'd forgotten how bodies moved in joy, rather than in the throes of death. Marjorie danced with Thomas, the baby strapped to her chest in a sling, and she thought about the bride she'd been a year ago, wearing black in the church doorway, marrying a man she barely knew out of necessity and survival. She'd thought then that she might learn to love him, given time, and she'd been right. She loved him now, loved him for his gentleness and his strength, for the way he held their son, for the way he'd given her a reason to wake up each morning. "Happy anniversary," Thomas murmured in her ear as they swayed to the music. "We survived," Marjorie said. It was the greatest achievement she could name. "We did more than survive," Thomas replied. He touched Hugh's small head gently. "We lived, and it was true. They'd lived. They'd married and made a home and brought a child into the world, and those acts of creation were worth something. They were worth everything." Winter came again, and with it more hardships. Food was scarce. The harvest had been better than the year before, but still not enough, and there was no surplus from previous years to fall back on. Those stores had been depleted or had rotted when there was no one to tend them. People were hungry. Not starving, not yet, but the specter of famine loomed alongside the plague. Hugh thrived despite everything. He grew fat on Marjorie's milk, reached his small milestones on schedule or even early. By his first winter, he could sit up and grab things and babble nonsense syllables that Marjorie swore were words. He was, by any measure, a miracle. 3 more babies were born in the village that winter. Young Alice delivered all of them, her skills and confidence growing with each birth. 2 of the babies survived. 1 did not. The one who died simply never started breathing properly, turned blue despite everything Alice tried, and slipped away within hours. His mother sobbed for days, inconsolable, and Marjorie held her and let her cry, and thought about how fragile life was, how tenuous their hold on joy. But 2 survived. 2 new lives. Combined with Hugh, that was 3 babies in a village that had almost none a year ago. It felt like an omen, like maybe the worst was past. The plague did ease as 1350 wore on. It never disappeared entirely. There were still occasional cases, still deaths that bore its mark, but the wave had crested and broken. People started to hope, cautiously, that perhaps they might live. Perhaps their children might grow up. Perhaps there would be a future after all. With that hope came the hard work of rebuilding. The village had to reorganize itself, had to figure out how to function with a fraction of its former population. Fields that had been abandoned needed to be reclaimed or left to go wild. Houses that stood empty needed to be decided upon. Would new families move in, or would they be dismantled for materials? The social structure had been shattered, with traditional families destroyed and new configurations emerging. Orphans were taken in by whoever could feed them. Widows and widowers remarried, sometimes multiple times as partners died and survivors had to pair up again. It was a time of strange fluidity. Class distinctions that had been rigid in the time before mattered less now. A farmer's daughter might marry a merchant's son. A craftsman's widow might take up with a nobleman's bastard. There simply weren't enough people to maintain the old hierarchies. Survival mattered. Capability mattered. Blood and breeding mattered less. Marjorie watched these transformations with fascination. Young Alice, for instance, who'd been nobody in particular before the plague, had become indispensable to the village's survival. Her healing skills were precious, her calm competence in crisis invaluable. Men began courting her, offering marriage, and she turned them all down. She liked her independence, she said. She liked being useful. Maybe later, she told Marjorie, after things were more settled. Maybe then she'd think about marriage and babies. But for now, she had work to do. Thomas's work shifted too. Less carpentry for individual households, more community projects. They needed to repair the church, which had fallen into disrepair. They needed to fix the mill, which had stopped working when the miller died, and his apprentice died, and no one was left who knew exactly how to keep it running. Thomas figured it out through trial and error and help from other survivors who remembered bits and pieces of the necessary knowledge. It took months, but eventually the mill wheel turned again, and they could grind grain properly, and that was another small victory. Hugh grew and changed. His first word was "da," pointed at Thomas, and Thomas nearly cried with joy. His second word was "ma," and Marjorie did cry. He learned to crawl, then to pull himself up on furniture, then to take his first wobbling steps. Each milestone felt momentous, a defiance of the death that had claimed so many other children. On Hugh's first birthday, they had a small celebration. Margaret baked a special cake using precious honey that John the Smith had found in a wild hive. The other village children came. There were 7 of them now, counting the babies, and they played together in the summer sunshine, while the adults watched and marveled at the resilience of young life. Marjorie stood with Thomas, his arm around her waist, and watched their son laugh as an older girl made faces at him. 2 years ago, she said quietly, I thought I would die. I thought we would all die. But we didn't, Thomas said. No, Marjorie agreed. We didn't. She thought about her wedding day, about standing in the church doorway in her black dress, about the 11 witnesses who'd come to see her married. Of those 11, 7 remained. Old Peter had died in the winter, his old body finally giving out. Edmund Tanner had died of a wound that went septic. Not the plague, but dead nonetheless. Margaret Weaver had remarried and moved to a neighboring village. Ann Cook had died of fever in the spring, and they'd never been sure if it was the plague or something else. But the others survived. John the Smith with his one arm, young Alice with her herbs and her competence, William Fletcher, Sarah Miller. They'd all made it through, had all survived the worst dying any of them had ever witnessed. And there were new people, too. Travelers who'd heard that this village had survived relatively intact, who'd come looking for a community to join. A tinker who'd lost his entire family and wanted a place to settle. A widow from 2 villages over who'd married William Fletcher and brought her 3 children with her. A young couple who'd fled the cities and thought rural life might be safer. The village was growing again. Slowly, tentatively, but growing. By Hugh's 2nd birthday, the population had climbed to nearly 90. Still far fewer than the 300 it had been before, but more than the nadir of 50 or so in the worst days of the plague. Life developed new rhythms, new patterns. They learned to live with the grief that never quite left, the way you might learn to live with a permanent injury. The dead were mourned, but also gradually allowed to become memory rather than open wound. People spoke of lost loved ones with sadness, but also with fondness, telling stories, keeping them alive in the only way left. Marjorie found herself pregnant again in the autumn of Hugh's 2nd year. She was more confident this time, less afraid. Her body had done this before, and successfully. Alice had become skilled at midwifery, had delivered a dozen babies now with good outcomes. The world felt more stable, more survivable. The 2nd baby, another son, arrived in late spring. They named him Thomas, after his father, but called him Tom to avoid confusion. He was bigger than Hugh had been, louder, more demanding. Hugh regarded his new brother with deep suspicion at first, then gradually warmed to him, would bring him toys, and pat his head with somewhat alarming force, while saying, "Baby," proudly. Thomas the elder was equally delighted with his 2nd son. 2 sons felt like insurance, like perhaps their line would continue. Perhaps there would be grandsons someday, great-grandsons, a future that stretched forward instead of being cut off by death. The plague continued its retreat. By 1352, it was rare to hear of new cases, though they did still occur, especially among travelers from other regions where the disease still burned hot. The village developed an informal quarantine system. Newcomers were asked to stay in an isolated cottage for a week before being allowed to fully integrate into the community. It wasn't perfect, but it helped. The fields were fuller now, more land under cultivation. The herds had grown old Peter's sheep, multiplying under the care of his son who'd taken over the flock, and cattle, and pigs, and goats. The chickens had flourished, as chickens do, and most households had at least a few laying hens. The mill ran consistently. The church had been repaired and reconsecrated by a traveling priest who de-stopped through and agreed to perform the ceremony. Services were held regularly again, led by various villagers since they still had no resident priest, but it felt good to gather in the sanctuary, to sing hymns, to pray together. Young Alice finally did marry, in 1353, to a newcomer named Robert, who'd been a physician as apprentice before the plague and shared her interest in healing. They made a formidable team, Alice with her practical knowledge and Robert with his book learning, and between them, They established something like a medical practice for the village and surrounding area. People came from miles around to consult with them, and their house became a center of activity, always full of patients and apprentices learning the healing arts. Hugh started helping Thomas in the workshop when he turned 4, learning to hold tools and sandwood and develop the skills that would make him a carpenter like his father. He was a serious child, thoughtful and careful, and Thomas was patient with him, showing him techniques, letting him make mistakes, teaching him the craft. Tom, in contrast, was wild and chaotic, constantly in motion, constantly into things he shouldn't be. He kept Marjorie running from dawn to dusk, chasing after him, rescuing him from various predicaments. But he was also joyful in a way that felt precious, his laughter ringing through the house, his enthusiasm for life infectious. And then, in 1354, Marjorie discovered she was pregnant a 3rd time. She was 30 years old now, which felt impossibly old sometimes and impossibly young others. She'd lived through the plague. She'd buried her entire birth family. She'd married and made a new family and survived. And now she was going to have a 3rd child, and the world felt stable enough, safe enough, that she could welcome this new life without the terror that had accompanied her first pregnancy. The baby, a daughter this time, arrived in early winter. They named her Catherine, after the church and after Thomas's mother, who died years before. She was small and delicate and had Marjorie's eyes, and Hugh and Tom were both fascinated by their new sister, wanting to hold her and touch her and help care for her. "Our family," Thomas said one evening, looking at Marjorie nursing Catherine while the boys played near the hearth. "Our family." He said it with such wonder, such gratitude, that Marjorie felt tears prick her eyes. They'd made this, the 2 of them. They'd taken the wreckage of the plague years and built something beautiful from it. 3 children, healthy and thriving. A home full of life and laughter and love. The village continued to grow and stabilize. By 1355, the population had reached over 100. New houses were being built on the outskirts of town. There were children everywhere. It seemed making noise and causing trouble and representing hope. The plague had become something people spoke of in the past tense, at least locally during the plague years, or before the dying time, or when the pestilence came. It was history now, living history certainly, still fresh in memory, and still marked on the landscape in the form of overgrown fields and abandoned houses and many graves in the churchyard, but history nonetheless. There were changes beyond their village, too. Word filtered in from travelers and merchants about how the world had transformed. Labor was scarce everywhere, which meant surviving workers could demand higher wages. Peasants were leaving their traditional manners, seeking better opportunities. The old feudal order was crumbling, undermined by the simple fact that there weren't enough people to maintain it. Lords needed workers more than workers needed lords. It was a strange reversal, one that made the older generation uncomfortable, but that the younger people embraced. Hugh would grow up in a world where his labor had value, where he could negotiate his own terms rather than being bound to the land and lord his father had served. That was something precious, something that had been bought with the lives of millions, but that might possibly be worth the terrible cost. Marjorie watched her children grow and thought often about the bride she'd been, standing in the church doorway in black. She'd been so young then, so broken, so certain that the world was ending. And in a sense, it had ended. The world of her childhood, the certainties and structures she'd grown up with, had been swept away by the plague as thoroughly as a village in the path of a flood. But something new had emerged from the ruins. Not better. Exactly how could anything be better when so many had died? But different. More fluid, more dynamic, less rigid. A world where a farmer's daughter who'd lost everything could marry a carpenter and build a new life and raise children who might become anything. She thought about her parents sometimes, her siblings, all the dead she carried with her. She wondered what they would think of the life she'd made, of the woman she'd become. Her mother had been so careful about propriety, about doing things the right way, about maintaining social distinctions. Would she approve of Marjorie's choices? Or would she be horrified? But then Marjorie would look at her children, at Hugh's serious concentration as he worked with wood, at Tom's wild joy as he played, at Catherine's tiny perfection as she slept, and she thought her mother would understand. Family had always been what mattered most to her mother. Family and love and survival. Marjorie had honored those values. She'd survived, and she'd loved, and she'd made a family. Thomas, too, had grown and changed. The quiet, grieving widower she'd married had become something else, a leader in the village, a teacher to his sons, a loving husband and father. He laughed more now. The shadow of Eleanor had lightened, not disappeared, but integrated into who he was, rather than defining him entirely. He could speak of her fondly now, tell Hugh and Tom about their half-sibling who'd never lived, keep her memory present without drowning in grief. One evening, as they sat by the fire after the children were in bed, Thomas took Marjorie's hand. "I need to tell you something," he said, and his tone was serious enough that Marjorie felt a flutter of worry. "What is it?" "I'm grateful," he said simply, "for you, for our life, for our children. I know we married out of necessity, because the plague had left us both alone, and the village needed us to survive and continue. But it became something more than that. You became more than that. You're my wife, truly, and I love you, truly. I wanted you to know." Marjorie squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar warmth, the pulse of life that had become so precious to her. "I love you too," she said. "I didn't expect to, at first. But I do. You gave me a reason to survive, and then you gave me a reason to live. That's worth everything." They sat in companionable silence, listening to the crackle of the fire, the sounds of their children breathing in sleep, the night wind rustling the thatch overhead. Outside, the village slept, those 100+ souls who'd made it through the dying time and built something new in its wake. The plague had taken so much from all of them. Parents and children, siblings and friends, entire families wiped out in days or weeks. It had taken the world they'd known, the certainties they'd relied on, the future they'd expected. But it hadn't taken everything. It had left survivors, and those survivors had proven remarkably stubborn in their determination to live. They'd married in the shadow of death, Marjorie and Thomas, and all the other plague couples. They'd promised to love in sickness and in health when sickness seemed to be winning. They'd brought children into a world that was killing children by the thousands. And somehow, improbably, impossibly, they'd made it work. Their children would grow up knowing the plague as history, as the terrible thing that happened before they were born. Hugh and Tom and Catherine would hear stories about grandparents they'd never met, about the village that used to be 3 times larger, about the years when death seemed to be everywhere. But they'd also know the world that came after, the world their parents had built from the ashes. That world wouldn't be perfect. The plague would return, periodically, in smaller waves over the coming decades and centuries. Death would always be present, always be waiting, but life would be present too. Love would be present. Hope would persist, stubborn and unkillable as weeds pushing up through stones. Years passed. Hugh grew into a fine carpenter, eventually taking over Thomas's workshop. Tom, surprisingly, developed an interest in healing and apprenticed with Alice and Robert. Catherine showed an early gift for numbers and became something rare, a woman who could read and write and calculate, skills she learned from Robert, who believed women were as capable of learning as men. She eventually married a merchant and helped him run his business, her mind for figures making them prosperous. Marjorie and Thomas grew old together, watching their children marry and have children of their own. Grandchildren filled their house, demanding stories, getting into mischief, representing the future that had seemed so impossible during the plague years. Thomas died first, in his sleep, at the age of 71, which was a good long life by any standard. Marjorie mourned him properly, deeply, but without the desperate grief of her youth. He'd lived well and fully, had seen his children and grandchildren thrive, had contributed to his community's survival and flourishing. It was a good death, as deaths go. Marjorie lived another 5 years, dying at 76, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. In her final days, when her mind wandered between past and present, she thought often of her wedding day. The bride in black, the 11 witnesses, the promise to love until death parted them. She'd kept that promise. She'd loved Thomas, loved their children, loved the life they'd built together from the ruins of the plague. And now, as death finally came for her, she felt at peace. She'd survived. She'd lived. She'd loved. And that, in the end, was everything. The village continued after her, growing and changing, eventually losing all living memory of the plague years, but retaining them in stories passed down through generations. The church where Marjorie and Thomas married eventually crumbled and was rebuilt, crumbled and was rebuilt again. But the site remained, a continuity of place, if not of structure. And in the churchyard, among the hundreds of plague victims buried in those terrible years, there were also the graves of survivors. Marjorie and Thomas, side by side, young Alice and Robert, John the Smith, William Fletcher, Sarah Miller, all those who'd lived through the dying and built lives in its aftermath. Their graves bore simple markers with simple inscriptions, names and dates mostly. But if you knew the history, if you knew the stories, those dates told an extraordinary tale. These were the people who'd survived the Black Death. These were the people who'd married in the shadow of the plague and loved anyway. These were the people who'd brought children into a dying world and raised them to adulthood. These were the people who'd refused to let death have the final word. They'd been ordinary people, by and large. Farmers and craftspeople, housewives and laborers, the backbone of medieval village life. They hadn't done anything extraordinary, hadn't performed miracles, or made great discoveries, or changed the course of history through individual acts of heroism. They'd simply survived. They'd simply loved. They'd simply continued. And in a world where half the population died, where cities were decimated and whole villages were wiped out, where death seemed to reign supreme, that was the most extraordinary thing of all. The plague weddings, those hasty unions formed out of necessity and survival, became something more. They became acts of defiance, celebrations of life in the face of death, promises that tomorrow mattered even when today was terrible. They were flawed and complicated and born of desperation, but they were also beautiful in their own way, these partnerships of survivors. Marjorie, standing in the church doorway in her black dress, could never have imagined the life she'd build with Thomas. She could never have foreseen the children and grandchildren, the years of love and work and ordinary joy. She'd married believing she was simply doing what had to be done, fulfilling a duty to her community and her own survival. But what she'd actually done was plant a seed. And from that seed, watered by love and tended by persistence, grew a family tree that would extend forward through centuries, its branches spreading into the future, its roots anchored in that terrible autumn, when death seemed to be everywhere, but love insisted on surviving anyway. That was the legacy of the plague weddings. Not perfect love or fairy tale endings, but something more valuable and more real, the stubborn, persistent, ordinary miracle of people who chose life and love even when death seemed inevitable, and who built futures from the wreckage of the past. Marjorie would have been proud of that legacy. She would have been proud to know that her great-great-great-grandchildren would tell stories about the bride who wore black, who married a widower she barely knew, who survived the plague and built a life worth living. She would have been proud to know that in the face of history's greatest pandemic, In the midst of unimaginable loss, she and Thomas and all the other survivors had done the most human thing possible. They'd loved, they'd hoped, they'd continued. And in the end, love after loss, that was everything.